768. I'll put in the address.
All right, Deb, thank you. Congratulations. Joseph, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I hear you, but you're invisible.
Uh-oh.
Go ahead. There you are.
We have a 2-1 in La Mesa coming up, about 750 square feet. It's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. Going to be listed at $699. We have pictures already taken, so if you have anyone interested, I'll send them over to you. We're looking to list next week.
Nice work with those coming soon, you guys. Congratulations. Anybody else, drop it in the chat if you have stuff you want to talk about. Post it to Facebook, holler it out, and let's make sure Robert has every breathing minute so he doesn't beat me later to get through today's content. Tune in and pay attention, y'all. Take it away, BB.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm so sorry that we had to go to a hybrid today, but I blame all of you guys for getting me sick. It's really good to see Lisa Bulkin on the call. Hi, Lisa. And a lot of our top agents on the call, because you're the ones that are doing the business that I want to make sure that, especially if you have a lot of listings, we're going to talk today about some of the changes, and everything is changing. I'm sorry. Everything is changing by the second. So we're going to cover some of that, and we'll get to, so hold on one second. I'm going to share my screen. Make sure I share the right screen. Okay. Can everybody see that? Are you seeing the PowerPoint? Okay,
yes, sir.
Great. Now I'm going to bring up the chat box. Here's what I like. This is going to be very interactive today as well, too. I want you to ask questions. And so if you have a question, what I'd like you to do, if you're in the room at KW Metro, I want you to go to the front of the room and raise your hand as part of to be in the queue. So we can make sure everybody raises their hand on the Zoom, and we'll get to the questions as necessary, as much as I can. So this is your risk management for July 31st, 2024. And you know, your broker is a little spiritual sometimes. We are entering into a Mercury retrograde. We're probably already into it because it starts August 5th. What does that mean to you guys? Well, when Mercury goes retrograde, Mercury is the planet of communication. What happens is some people will speak before they think. So for the next month, through the end of August, probably first week of September, if you find that conversations aren't going that well with people that you're communicating with, I highly suggest that you go ahead and stop, pause, and if it needs to be said, is it kind? Can you give a different response? Could you ask for clarity about what they are saying rather than going off? Because that's what will happen when Mercury goes retro. Just remember that. All right. All right. Let's keep moving. Today we're going to cover I'm going to ask you all if you've taken the car representation and residential listing agreement bundle online, if you've all registered. And then we're going to talk about the KW Metro transaction opening documents and zip form templates, give an update on that. And every car form release and update, I'm going to give you a link for that. We're not going to cover everything. Then we're going to get to the top things for the RL, if you're for residential listings, and what you need to know and how to handle agent inquiries. I'm getting those questions. Agent inquiries meaning, are you cooperating? Is the seller cooperating, not cooperating? And we got to get rid of that word cooperating. And then the BRBC, top things to know. And of course, then some stuff from Mark as well, too. So show of hands, you can just raise your hand. If you have registered for the 2-part bundle of the residential listing agreement and the BRBC, and you've listened to them. And Jacqueline, since you're in the room, maybe you can see how many hands are not raised.
There are only 3.5 hands raised out of about, I'm gonna call it 12.
Okay. So,
but 2 so that counts as 0.25 more.
So you're going to ask, how do I register for this? Well, Evie has blasted out through Facebook and through email a link to all of this, including this PowerPoint in a PDF. And all you need to do is click on the very top of this car buyer representation RLA bundle online anytime. Click on that. It will take it to it so you can register. Here's the sad statistic. There's 127,000 brokers in the state of California. There's 310,000 agents. So CAR was excited last Friday when they've had 40,000 people register for this. That's kind of scary. So what does that mean? You guys will be educating some of these agents on the outside. We're already seeing it. Some brokerages, and you know, I don't disparage any broker, but I hear that they're just going to take a wait and see approach. And that's not good, because we're going to have to help them through a complex navigation through this next few months. And by the way, if you're sending stuff in the chat and I'm not seeing it directly to me, someone will use, if that you have a chat box, can you pull it up directly?
You got it.
Please, if you have not registered, please go to that. Okay. Mark has updated the KW Metro transaction opening documents. These are the files that you will need to open a transaction, whether it's a listing agreement or a buyer agreement or a purchase agreement. People always ask for a checklist. Well, there is no checklist. The checklist would be outdated the day we print it, because they're always adding new forms. So what we do is we update a transaction opening document checklist, and that's as close as we can get. And then Mark, when you submit your transactions to compliance, he then gives you a very nice detailed review about what you need to add or take away. And then Mark, if you're on the call, I'd like you to give an update on the zip form templates, if and when you will have them updated, and what agents will need to look for, and how will they, what they need to do.
I think we're about 75% of the way to release on those. We have just a little bit more work to do to make sure that they're, you know, absolutely correct. They're going to be a little bit simplified from those of you that have used the templates in the past. There's going to be fewer forms to make it easier for you just to see what you need. And you can always add items to your transaction for specialty type transactions that require specialized forms. I'm going to try and release them over the weekend, but if not, it'll be early next week at the latest. And then we'll send an announcement out in the Facebook group and in other places that will give you the instructions on how to install and move on from there. And I highly recommend that you do install the templates, because basically, if you start a new transaction, it's completely blank. If you use our transaction templates and you apply them when you create the new transaction, it preloads many of the forms that you're going to need into your transaction. It's going to save you a bunch of time. So please do it.
So Mark, if you're planning on releasing over the weekend, will you be covering this next week at Mondays with Mark, possibly?
Yeah,
Can you
definitely. We can do it, you know, the segment on that, you know, as far as like what the ideas are, the strategies behind using the templates, and actually walk through some of them to show some of the differences in the different fields and things that we've added this time around.
And then can you explain for a newer agent, what exactly are the templates? When you're saying templates, what are they?
Right, exactly. It's kind of like, think of it like you're making cookies and you're using a cookie cutter. You get the same pattern every time. You install these templates into your ZipForm Personal Edition account. And then when you create a new transaction, there's a section in that screen where after you name the transaction and you go to residential, down near the bottom, it says, would you like to apply a template to this? And you go to that pull down menu and you pick the appropriate one. And we have three. We have buyer representation. Excuse me, we don't have buyer. We have referral agent to agent. We have a purchase transaction, which also includes the buyer representation forms. And we have a listing transaction.
And I can't thank Mark enough for being my partner in crime. I don't think I would have gotten through this last decade, really without Mark, but he's been working just as hard as we all have to navigate through this. And he's helping keeping it organized and systematic because of all the changes, and they change daily. So Mark, I know I like dark chocolate. What do you like? What do you want to be lavished with?
I'm into Dominican cigars and single malt scotch. Just kidding, just kidding.
So just put your address in the chat box and we'll make sure you get that. All right, thank you, Mark, and stay on the line because you're going to answer. So this link is every car form and release update that I put together. So this is what Evie has sent out to you guys. So when you click on this link, this is all the documents that I want you to go through because we've been given a ton of stuff from CAR. And I'm trying to whittle it down in such a way so it's not so overwhelming. But most of the documents that I've loaded in here are the documents I want you to look at and go through because this is a lot of the questions that are going to come up from for you guys. Next, RLA, top things to know. These are the questions I've been getting. So what I want to cover on the RLA specifically, and this is where agents, if you have questions, I want you to ask them now. Okay, so here's the things I want to highlight on the RLA that is probably going to be pretty important for you guys to understand. And that is in section 2C of the RLA, and the RLA addresses compensation. So remember, we're going to get rid of the word cooperating because cooperating broker compensation is going to be dead and buried. So section 2C, C1, 4B identifies the compensation that you as the listing agent will get from the seller to sell their home. This covers just your fee. It doesn't cover a buyer's agent fee. It doesn't cover any other fee. This is just your fee. So if you're normally accustomed to getting 3% of the listing agreement and you used to cooperate 3%, that would be a 6% listing. But now it's going to be a 3% listing for you. And that's in 2C1, section 4B. That's what that section addresses. The next section, section 2C2, and this is where a lot of confusion has come up on the CAR regional calls every Friday. And this is the additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. Now, this was the fear that I had as broker that what we're probably, you as a listing agent is probably going to see is a lot more agents or buyers walk in or call the broker directly, the listing agent directly, and say, I don't have an agent, but I want to write an offer. So what's the challenge with that though? Well, this section addresses if the buyer is unrepresented, meaning they don't have an agent and you're not going to represent them as well, but they want to make an offer on that property. So what problem does that pose? Well, they're not going to know or have CAR zip forms. Now, CAR zip forms does license those forms. People can go buy them and use them. And we have had instances where we've had attorneys come and write offers on properties. We've had old real estate agents that haven't been in the business for 20 years. They use a form, but that form is from 2015 or 2012, or we had one last week that was outdated from the new update that was released on 7/24. And we told the buyer's agent, you have to go submit on the new form because there's 2 items in the new purchase agreement that needs to be in there because it needs to reflect the new standard of operating procedure. So for you agents and that typically make it a habit of asking of negotiating with your seller. If a buyer walks in the door and says, I don't have representation, I don't want you to represent me, I want to make an offer. Typically in the past, what you would do is talk to the broker or the homeowner about, well, if that buyer wants me to represent them, then I will negotiate a fee. So how has this happened in the past? Like typically what we have seen, and Mark can correct this, let's say you took a 6% listing, but then you offered to the seller, if the buyer walked in the door and you wanted to negotiate the offer with that buyer, you would do the whole thing for 5%. And then you would represent both buyer and seller. That's not what this is saying right here, though. You're not representing this buyer under a representation agreement. So what you're going to have to do in this case is, one, you need to have a conversation with your seller at the time that you're taking the listing agreement with them. And have that conversation if an unrepresented buyer walks in the door. And legally, you're obligated to present all offers to the buyer. Or I'm sorry, to the seller. But what happens is, if a buyer walks in the door, writes an offer on an old car document, or even just something they bought at the stationery store, you're going to have to now write that counter offer on the new RPA and fill in that stuff, meaning you're going to have to do extra work on that listing for that unrepresented buyer. And then where does agency come into play? Agency is when you start acting on behalf of a principal and doing things for them outside of the normal course of just giving them information. And so in other words, are you helping them fill out the disclosures? Are you giving them information on the disclosures? Are you giving them advice about where to go for lending? Are you giving them advice, any type of advice? That's where we create what's called implied agency. We don't have a written document that shows that we created agency, but we create implied agency. So this is a very prickly path for you listing agents that think you want to represent an unrepresented buyer, where you're going to be doing more work. So now this is the discussion. This is where I want to have a discussion with listing agents. And I see Bridget's asking a lot of questions in here. So Bridget, do you want to make some comments about what you think this will be for your business and how you think you might need to navigate through this?
Yeah, and I'm so confused right now, but so I'm longing for this conversation.
Okay, great. Perfect time to have it.
First of all, I've listened to a couple of the classes on this. In general, I think this new contract is going to be easier. It's going to be a pain in the butt for us for a couple weeks while we get our bearings straight, but this is going to make it easier for us to explain everything to our clients. There are a few things that I do think are a little wonky. I was talking in the chat about the section C2, which is basically your buyer non-agency, where you're getting paid some excess fee. The thing I don't like is they should have put that as an optional checkbox right there for the buyer non-agency.
Agreed.
So it's very clear, but nobody asked me my opinion, I guess, so it doesn't matter. But I think that is something we need to kind of explain, make sure that's clear to our agents, that doing just this checkbox of the additional compensation to seller's broker is not sufficient. You have to make sure you explain buyer non-agency and have it documented and signed, just like any other transaction.
Yes.
I might add to that it's probably not a checkbox in the RLA, because the buyer non-agency form is related to a purchase transaction, not the listing transaction. But they could make a reference in the body, like maybe in 4C, that should be, and maybe it is in 4C, I honestly don't know, that a BNA should be used if the seller and listing agent elect to do 2C2.
So for you agents that double in, this is important for you to navigate through this and have that conversation up front with the sellers. Again, by the way, not everybody's approved a double end transaction. You've got to get approval from me, because they're most litigated of the transactions. And they're the worst ones that I've had to deal with in the past year, especially when a buyer and seller are at odds with each other. And I'm not talking just one agent doing both sides. I'm talking about when we represent a buyer and seller, even though they have two different agents, I have to walk a very thin line, because I don't want the buyer or seller to think I'm favoring one of them. So it's kind of challenging at best to deal with. But with this one thing right here, if you're having that conversation with the seller, because now this form, the RLA, does not talk about any type of payment to a buyer's broker. Instead, what you might want to do now is discuss with that seller that I think the best route for me as your agent is to put that buyer that comes in unrepresented in a buyer broker relationship. and then consummate a BRBC to actually start writing up the offer for that buyer. And then that's where you get the commission. The listing agent's still going to go ahead and pay you your full commission, but now you're going to get the commission negotiated from the buyer's agent, where the buyer is going to pay the fee directly. And now you're going to have a conversation with the seller. Well, how much are you willing to pay if I represent that buyer as well too? And what does that look like?
To be clear on this, 2C2 is not dual agency, completely unrelated to the listing agent also representing the buyer in an agency capacity. 2C2 of the RLA is only to address a unique situation where an unrepresented buyer, and if you will, kind of like the opposite of a FSBO, where you've got an unrepresented seller, an unrepresented buyer may show interest in the seller's property that you have listed. 2C2 addresses that possibility for you to ask for additional compensation from the seller to deal with that unrepresented buyer in a non-agency capacity.
I think the big takeaway from this is that in the past, we knew what a seller was willing to pay for cooperating broker compensation. And now the buyer and buyer's agent is coming in not knowing, because we can't define it. And we're going to discuss a little bit of that later in the presentation. But Mark and I were having a friendly conversation earlier about this, about how do we navigate through this. Because I love playing pros and cons with Mark, because imagine my high D and his high C going at each other, because Mark's always between the lines, and I'm like, no, I got to think about what are the agents hearing, what are the listing agents hearing out there. So this is a question now too. I want to know, what are you as listing agents hearing from your principals out there in the field? What are they asking you? What are they saying? Anybody?
Can I use an example? Because I used this form last week for a listing.
Yes.
And I did use the 2C2. And so I had an existing listing that needed to be transferred over to these new forms. And so in having my conversation with my clients, we talked about the 2.5% going to the seller's brokerage in C1. And then we had a conversation about the C2 section. And I said, this is just a possibility that this might happen. And what it means for me as your agent and my brokerage is that we're taking on additional work and additional liability for an unrepresented buyer, especially if we're not representing them on the other end of the deal. And so what I'm asking for is permission to give myself and my brokerage some extra revenue so that we can cover and hedge that bet for ourselves so that nobody gets in trouble. So
Dan, would you repeat that, please? Because I want to drive that point home.
Yeah. So I made sure that my clients knew that there was the chance of this happening is slim, but we expect that to increase over time, that somebody's going to come in unrepresented, and that because I'm not representing them, myself and my brokerage takes on additional liability and risk, and that we need some we are requesting additional compensation should that happen, so that we can make sure this transaction goes through smoothly for my clients, but not represent the buyer in the transaction. It'll mean more work, more liability, and still we'll try to get the deal done for you.
And the other thing to mention to the seller is that they're only obligated to pay the amount in 2C2 if this unique situation occurs where there is an unrepresented buyer. If a buyer comes and makes an offer on the seller's property from another brokerage or from a buyer's agent from within our brokerage, 2C2 does not apply.
And I'm loving seeing what Bridget is putting in the chat. Simple answer, just don't double in and keep your business clean. And she still thinks there's a lot of buyer liability with buyer non-agency. Yes, there is. There's a lot more liability with the BNA, because you're doing all the work for that buyer and they don't want representation. And just be prepared to write a $10,000 deductible for your E&O if there's ever a claim. So just remember that there's a lot more liability in it. You've got to save, if you're going to double in, save $10,000 every year just in case you end up in a claim. And can't tell you the merits of cases, but every case that we've entered in this year, almost every one of them has been because it's been dual agency. And they've been my most sleepless nights dealing with it. Okay,
Robert, I have a question.
yes.
So how do we handle that if we want to respectfully decline an unrepresented buyer, or our sellers do? Can we say that? Can,
Well, you don't have to, you don't have to act on behalf of that unrepresented buyer. But if
So
they're
how
going
do we
to give
tell
you
them
an
go get a
offer,
broker or
if
go
they're
get
going to give you an offer, you need to present that offer. And which means if they're giving you an offer on an old form, then the extra work that goes into play is that you're required then to now counter back with the new RPA as part of that counter.
But I'm saying if they say, okay, we don't have an agent and we want to write up an offer, how do I tell them? Well, you're going to go have to get an agent. I mean,
No.
you know what I'm saying? Like, how do we handle that conversation?
Part of the terminology that's in the buyer non-agency agreement, which I know everyone's going to go out and read right after we get done here, is that in servicing the seller as the listing agent can provide forms to an unrepresented buyer for them to complete on their own. Okay, so you do the BNA first. That's absolutely necessary to send an email to this buyer and to say, I am not your agent. I'm merely providing you with the forms to facilitate your offer on this property. You give them the BNA, you get that back signed before you send them any forms. And then if you do send them forms, I'd highly recommend on the purchase agreement that you fill out the property address and the seller's name. Why? Because you don't want that unrepresented buyer using your forms to go make an offer on some other property that you have absolutely no involvement in by giving a completely blank form. So fill out the property address of the listed property that you have listed for sale, fill out the seller's name, and then you can provide those forms to an unrepresented buyer to let them complete them and return them. If in the scenario that you asked about, Corrine, where they went out to an office supply store and bought forms, or they went out to First Tuesday and bought some electronic forms or whatever, and you receive an offer on a non-standard form, then our recommendation is in your seller counteroffer that you add and incorporate all of the terminology in the California Residential Purchase Agreement Revision 724 as a part of the purchase agreement terms. Now, that then brings all of that standard language from the purchase agreement into this non-standard agreement that the buyer has submitted to make an offer on your seller's property. Hopefully that clears up some of that.
That's good to know, Mark. That's actually not what I was asking, but I'm glad that you went over that because that would be a question I'd naturally have afterwards. But I mean, if they don't have, they want us to do, to give them, provide them the forms, but Bridget brought up that still creates liability, even doing a BNA. Can we say?
Just refer it out, Corrine, to me. I'll take it for you. I got you.
Can we say the seller will only accept offers from, we can't do that, I'm sure.
No,
Well,
you can't do that.
You just have to accept give them the BNA and just do it.
I know what I would say, but it's not NSFW. So okay, so I want to keep up time. So I think Amy raised her hand.
I have a question.
Put your hand up, Deborah. I got Amy first.
Okay, go ahead.
Mark, to pre-fill the address and the seller's name, should we also pre-fill seller agency? Like we represent seller exclusively, just to get our name on there?
You can do that. You can put in that you represent the seller and you leave the buyer agency field blank to indicate, or you could put none in there to indicate that the buyer is unrepresented.
Great, thank you.
All right, Deborah, since you have trying to figure out the hand raise button, go ahead.
I cannot figure out the hand raise button. Anyway, I know you find that hard to believe. Anyway, my question is, if you decide to tell the seller, the buyer, you present the all the information, all of that on the RPA, is that not creating agency?
Well, you're not really filling out anything that is would be considered advice or agency, type consulting with the buyer, the unrepresented buyer. All you're doing is protecting your forms basically by adding the property address of the listed property, your name as the agent, and, as Amy said, fill out section 2B with the agency indicating that you're representing the seller. Yeah, the risk that you get into in a BNA is you send the email to this unrepresented buyer, I'm not your agent. You give them the form, they complete the form, they send it in, and then subsequent to them signing it, you say, well, no, you filled out this section wrong. You should have filled it out like this. I mean, you can see it's a slippery slope that you can get on very easily because you switch from your listing agent hat to your buyer's agent hat. And that's the way we've operated in the past. And that's the risk that you run when you have a BNA is that subsequent action after the buyer signed it, where you advise them and then you create implied or accidental agency. That's the thing you really have to be careful of.
Okay, so thank you. And I want to keep on track because I got a few more things to cover, but this is, as broker, the worst thing I'm worried about is this situation where I want to know what you're seeing out there in the field if the buyers unrepresented are showing up a lot more. I think you might see that. Who knows? I'm hoping not. The next thing we're talking about is then, because we can't talk about cooperating broker compensation, I want to know what you're hearing from your sellers about, well, how do you convey what they're willing to offer as to a buyer's broker? Because you can't document it and put it in writing. And NAR hasn't given complete guidance on this yet. And we don't know yet from the MLSs. We do know from CRMLS that they will be putting a field in that will talk about concessions, and it will only be a yes or no field. And I just emailed SD. And so CRMLS, if you remember, PSAR or North County. Now I emailed SDMLS and they replied back that they won't have an answer for that until after the board of directors meet on the 1st. But here's some important dates with SDMLS I want you guys to take into consideration. SDMLS are slated to remove the CBB fields on 8/5 from the MLS Connect and on 8/12 for all Paragon platforms. And then CRMLS is 8/14. Is that right, Mark? 8/14 for CRMLS?
I thought it was the 13th, but
13th. Now, those are just some of the MLSs. Now, some of you sell properties in Palm Springs, Big Bear, LA, Orange County. You're going to be responsible to find out from each of those MLSs when you're doing a reciprocal relationship with them, what are those MLS rules about concessions, if they're going to have a field or not have a field. We're not going to have that's your responsibility as the agent, not Mark and not mine. That's your responsibility as an agent to find that out. So again, you've got to be much more informed if you're taking a listing outside of this area. And if you can put the term concession, yes or no, but it's not defined as a percentage or a dollar amount. So yes, Deborah, the CBB field will disappear in the Paragon on the 12th in CRM and SCMLS, and then on the 13th on CRMLS platforms.
And that also means that you buyer's agents absolutely have to have a written agreement before they write an offer for a buyer, or otherwise you're out of luck as far as commission goes.
And then I have been asked well, what can we put in confidential remarks? I don't know yet. And Mark and I went back and forth on this today. And you can communicate this back to an agent, because I want to hear if you obviously, who has a listing out there that has 0% in it? Anybody on this call right now? Nobody? Okay, well, this is going to happen when you don't have that CBB field. Agents are going to ask you, how much is the seller willing to pay? Well, you can't say, well, they're willing to pay 2.5%, 3%. What Mark wants you to say, and I kind of disagree, but Mark wants you to say, well, send an offer in and the seller will look at it. And that's kind of what CAR has taken the stance on, that they don't want anything mentioning, which is why they got rid of the CBC document. They want no mention of cooperating broker compensation in any of the forms. Because that's where they feel the entire country is going to go. And NAR just put out a statement today that's kind of reflecting what CAR is doing. That they're trying to get to the point where they say, yes, the seller will entertain, but you've got to just submit the offer.
We don't have a slide for what I just dropped in the chat, but it's a section from one of the forms that's now bundled with the RLA, the MLSA. And on that form, you listing agents have to obtain the seller's permission to be able to communicate that the seller is willing to offer some concessions. You can't be specific about what they are, but like this clause on the slide on the screen says, the seller will consider credits, but you cannot specify what they are because it's negotiable, and there's no place where the listing broker and the seller have memorialized what those credits might be. So take a look at that MLSA Section 5, and it explains what concessions are, and also that you have to obtain the authorization from the seller, because I believe the default answer is the seller does not authorize the broker to put in the MLS that they're willing to consider concessions. So you have to obtain permission to do so. And then the other point that I was going to make just went right out of my head. So I'll come back to that.
And then
And I have
Joseph, you asked what's stopping the listing agent from getting an MT on changing the CBC. Well, you're talking about an existing listing that has CBC in it, CBB in it. But I'm talking about what happens after when you've got to have the new RLA.
I remember what I wanted to say, and I didn't mean to step on you, Robert, but be very careful about putting any kind of clauses in the MLS that seem to convey cooperating broker compensation, because that's why the field was removed, because they did not want that offer of unilateral compensation in the MLS anymore. That was the whole core tenet or basis for the NAR litigation. So be very cautious about putting any kind of a clause in the remarks field, confidential remarks, that says anything about cooperating broker compensation.
Until we get guidance more from SDAR after the first. Bridget.
Well, I think Mark sort of just answered my question, but I was thinking for listing agents like myself that never double end, if there was a way for us to convey, you're not competing against me. I don't represent buyers on my own listings. Not necessarily guaranteeing that they would get a commission, but implying that I'm not trying to get buyers to come to me. Would that be a potential violation?
We'll find out.
Yeah, I mean, as you described it, I don't think so. You just if you're asked, will you represent me? Say no. When I represent the seller, I only represent the seller. I don't see a problem with that. And you might have an opportunity to do a referral to another agent.
I mean, specifically like talking, like if a buyer's agent calls us and
a buyer's agent, okay,
right, to explain, we don't, but we don't double end. So when you submit an offer to us, you're not going to be competing against me, kind of thing, as sort of not implying that we would co-op, but letting them know that I'm not going to represent any buyers.
Just don't put it in writing.
Verbal only.
Yeah,
Okay.
verbal only. All right, let's
When
move
I
on
have
to the BRBC, because I want to get through some of the important stuff I want to talk about on the BRBC. So hopefully now you guys, if you're working with a buyer, you should have all the buyers under existing BRBCs today. Because even though it doesn't take effect until the August 17th, you still have to have that buyer under BRBC today, because you're going to be probably going past the August 17th until you get that buyer into an escrow. So you've got to have the BRBC define the commission that you're willing to accept in working with them. So if you haven't done it yet,
our timeline's actually shorter than that, Robert. If the 8/5 is the date, the CBB field is going to be removed.
shorter, a lot shorter.
Yeah.
So get your BRBCs today. So here's some important parts that I want to cover is 2A1, the representation period cannot be longer than, does anybody know? 3 months. Thank you. 3 months. Why?
Put it in
Well,
you-
it's not defined here, but there's a bill going through the assembly that's going to limit it to 3 months. So CAR's being very forward looking about having it already documented that you can't do it longer than 3 months. The other section is 9B2 that I want you guys to remember. So 9B2 talks about the buyer's obligation to pay you. Now, I'm not going through the entire BRBC today because lack of time. I'll only bring up the points I want you guys to know that's important. So 9B2B talks about for a transaction, this agreement is contingent upon a seller or others or both agreeing to pay a broker the full amount that the buyer is contractually obligated to pay broker. This contingency is in favor of the broker, and broker may elect to cancel this agreement related to the representation on that specific property if the seller does not agree to pay the full amount that buyer is contractually obligated to pay. So the broker shall inform the buyer. So what is this section stating? You have a buyer under a BRBC. They know they can't pay because they don't have the money to pay the fee of whatever you're going to charge. Hopefully you've got everybody under 3% because that's what you're worth. I'm Miss Clairol because I'm worth it. Okay. So you've got them under a 3% BRBC and they can't afford to pay it though. And guess what? The seller isn't going to pay it either. They're not going to pay it. But that buyer wants this property. What do? Well, as the broker / agent, you can step out of this transaction and not represent that buyer on the property. Then they would become an unrepresented buyer for that listing agent with that seller. Does everybody understand what I just said?
Understand it? Yeah.
Yes.
And then you're out of the deal?
You're out of the deal.
And
Yep.
why in the world would anybody do that?
Because you wouldn't be paid. You'd
You wouldn't be paid.
known as a gratuitous buyer's agent, which would give you liability, but no compensation. Now, Robert and I discussed something, and I'll bring this up. This is not carved in stone. This is just an idea. But could you, in that scenario, as the buyer's agent, refer your buyer to the listing agent to not represent, that's the wrong word, to service as an unrepresented buyer, and you would receive a referral fee agreement, a fee for that. We don't know if it's just a theory, but it may be a solution in this situation. The other thing to remember here is that if you're going to do a modification of terms BR to exclude yourself from this particular property because you cannot be paid, you do it only for the specific property, because that way if the buyer cancels and goes on to look for other properties, your BRBC terms are still intact.
So what's the moral of this right here? What am I trying to get across to you guys?
Go get listings.
Go get listings, yeah. But what else I'm trying to say here is like, you've got to really, when you're having a buyer consultation, vet the buyer about their ability to pay if the seller's not willing to pay. You're going to have that conversation with them. Because this section right here says, oh, well, we'll just step out of the transaction. Good luck, go buy that house. We're not going to represent you. And you've done all this work, energy, time, and spent with this buyer, and now you're not going to get paid on a house that they want to buy. Do you get that? That's why now it's much more important with your BRBCs that you establish a relationship with qualified, capable, able, ready, willing buyers. Now is the time for you to realize you're not going to waste time with looky-loos that have no intention of closing anything. It's much more time to be serious with the people you're doing business with. And I think in the long run, this will be a good thing, but in the short run, these are some of the pitfalls you're going to come across as we navigate through the next 6 months to a year, where we figure out what sellers and how they're going to react about whether or not they want to pay, or if they have a listing agent that was good enough to convince them that they should pay. We are already seeing qualified, capable listing agents in this region that aren't even taking the time to convince a seller to pay. They're putting in CBBs of 0 right now because, quite frankly, they're tired of telling that seller that you got to pay. They're just going to let the seller figure it out, that no one's going to come show your property if you're not offering anything. And I think eventually it will flush itself out, but this is what we're dealing with right now.
And buyer's agents in your analysis, or you're working with the buyer, there's some new forms. If you have not taken that free buyer representation continuing education class, I strongly recommend you do that. There's a new form called buyer financial and personal information that you can have that buyer fill out in order for you to vet that buyer to know if they have the ability to conclude a transaction or not.
Susan.
There's a question in the room in regards to if we wanted to educate a bunch of clients at once. So say we have 10 buyers in our pipeline. Is there anything in writing that we could do to have that conversation just to start to explain some of this so that when we have our one-on-one consult with them, they've got sort of a lay of the land? Is there anything that CAR has put out?
Yes. The form is embedded into the form bundles, and it's the broker compensation advisory, and it addresses both buyer and seller side.
Good question, Susan.
Just to confirm, if we do put a buyer representation agreement in place at 3% and the seller is willing to pay less, we're okay to do a modification of terms if we don't want to have our buyer have to pay for the difference. Are you guys all okay with that?
Yes, of course you're okay to modify if it's less. What you're not able to do is to modify if it's the seller's willing to pay more. So in other words, if you're doing all your BRBCs at 2% and you come across a listing that's at 3% that the seller's willing to pay, guess what? You don't get that extra 1% and you can't ask for it. It goes back to the buyer. That's why you've got to know your value.
And
what are you worth? Good question, Susan. Thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate that.
And another, like, a peripheral aspect to that is you have to be very careful about treating all of your buyers the same. So make sure that you're not favoring one type of buyer over another type of buyer, because guess what? That could be a protected class violation, and you could find yourself in some kind of a fair housing complaint because you treated one buyer differently than another buyer. So be very careful to treat them all the same.
I like what Alicia says. You all need to be doing BRBCs at 4%. And Mike Law is saying that he's seeing an uptick at 3.5% on what a seller's willing to pay. And Lisa is asking the question, you have a listing coming up tomorrow. Do I need to update anything? Listing signed a month ago. Yes, you need to get the modification, the DM-RLA to modify that old, if you have the old listing agreement, or you can actually just replace it with the new listing agreement. And in your new listing agreement, say this listing agreement replaces the old listing agreement dated such and such date. I see we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. The next thing I want to do on the BRBC is item number 11, management approval. Why am I bringing this up? Guess what? Now you guys have to upload all of your BRBCs in Command. So you're going to have to create an opportunity for every buyer and upload into Command. What does that mean? Well, this is a buyer that isn't in contract or in escrow. You're just working with them. And the TCs aren't going to be doing this for free for all of your buyers that you're working with if they're not in escrow. So you're going to have to learn how to create an opportunity if you have not done that and you've relied on your TCs to do it, and use Command for what the intention was, to use the dashboard to see all your forward-looking business and keep track of all of your buyers about where they are in the pipeline. So it's a great opportunity to learn Command and what it's meant for at a higher level. But remember, you've got to submit all of your BRBCs within how quick, Mark?
Well, let's see, I believe that paragraph 11 says that management approval is within 5 days, just as the residential listing agreement, section 20 it says it's 5 days. So we need to see it after 2 business days. So if you sign something on a Friday, give it to us on a Monday. We just need to see it before that 5-day limit expires. And, this is all new. I'm seeing a lot of, errors already in BRBCs, like listing or representation periods longer than 3 months and so forth. So we need to take a look at them.
And you're going to have to read Mark's compliance review messages and not rely on your TCs, Joseph, to do all the work from it. All right. And then the other thing on the BRBC is it's on page 5, item 16. This is the confirmation of confirmation of compensation that you agreed to work with that buyer. So it shows the 2.5%. So when you submit an offer on the RPA and you select box 3G3, and you're going to bring in the form the SPBB, you're going to also then turn in this page, not the whole BRBC, just this page 5 of the BRBC, showing item 16, what the confirmation of compensation is that you've agreed to work with that buyer. And then also you can redact all of the buyer's private information, like an address or an email, just take it out, but have the buyer's name in there. And then you attach the form, the SPBB, when you're making the offer on the RPA, when you check box 3G3 of the RPA. Got that?
Oigavalt.
We're going over time. I'm sorry that we're doing that because there's just a lot. We did the car Q&A, update on the templates. Okay, Mondays with Mark. So I'm sure there's probably a lot of people that will be on Mondays with Mark next Monday at 11 o'clock. Is that correct? California time, Mark? And if you need help with the templates, that's probably
Correct.
what he's going to address this Monday. All right, we went through a lot. But I do want you to make sure that you read Mark's review messages, because there's going to be the details of what you'll need to do navigating through the next 3 to 6 months as we enter in this new era.
This is a lot of information, everybody. We're going to get through it. We have great tools and great educational resources. Please sign up for those free classes. They're going to be in your continuing education folder forever. So that you need to watch the BRBC class and the RLA class, and go back to them from time to time as you have questions that come up.
Mark and I have been on calls for the last 2 months, and it's changed tremendously. Every week it's something new. So any other last questions before we close? We're 6
Corrine
minutes.
has a
Yes,
question.
Corrine.
Thanks, Mark and Broker Bob. So is there any way we can have, I've been going to Mark's Monday classes, which are amazing. There's a lot of specific scenarios that I have as a listing agent and as a buyer's agent. Is there any way we can have like an actual role play with the two of you where we actually speak through these scenarios and figure out how we can say things and what we're not supposed, like I need real time advice from you guys and guidance.
You can always reach out to me if I'm not sleeping.
If you want to be on the phone with me for a couple hours, I don't think so, VB. You can't stand me if
I don't know. You buying?
No, wait a minute.
I would suggest going to, the car website that I dropped that link in, the broker compensation page, because there are a series of frequently asked questions, and there's also some quick guides on there that address some common scenarios and questions. So please take a look at those resources, and then we're certainly available to help with questions as needed.
I know that one other agent had called me after my call with you, Mark, and she said, "Oh, I wanted to hear what the rest of Mark's response was with that." So that's why I say, like, can we, because there's specific things that there's just so many ways that this can go in different scenarios. So
Well,
I think it
maybe,
would help us all.
Maybe I'll put an invitation out to anyone who wants to attend Mondays with Mark to come with one of those scenario questions, and we'll just walk through them.
That would be amazing if we can make one class just questions like that. Or
And what would be helpful is you pre-submit it to Mark so he's prepared.
Okay.
We do that with the CAR Q&A town hall. They submit the questions in advance.
There's
That
one
would be awesome.
question in the room, Robert.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I'm curious about any open house updates and what we need to be doing and forms we need to be signing to have at our open houses.
Again, that is in the listing agreement training that's in the continuing education training. There is a new form called
OHSA.
Open House -SI, and it's basically a sign-in sheet that explains to visitors to the open house that you're representing the seller, that you're not representing them as a buyer. You can only give them limited information. And then remember too, that in the BRBC training, the buyer representation training, there is the formal BRBC form, and then there's also a light form, which is a limited representation, only lasts for 30 days. That's the PR, I've forgotten the acronym, but there's two forms that you can use. If you have a buyer who's somewhat hesitant, doesn't necessarily want to commit to a full exclusive BRBC, you can introduce them to that lighter form. It's only 30 days, only good for 3 properties, and it's not exclusive. It's like a foot in the door with a buyer for a BRBC.
And then, is Kevin King on the call?
I did see him.
Well, if he's not here, reach out to Kevin. He's got he sent me a flyer he's making to prepare buyers that are
Right.
walking in the door that I approved for him to use. And it's
Yeah, I
kind of
used it.
outlines the different scenarios for every buyer that walks in the door.
I used it this past weekend, actually. So
What was that, Kevin?
I used it this past weekend, actually. So you get about half the people that want to read it and half the people that don't. The main 2 lines they're going to read is why should I sign in, and what happens if I don't sign in.
Kevin kills them if they don't sign in. Just kidding. But reach out to Kevin. Are you willing to share that, Kevin?
Sure.
Yep.
Yep.
All right. You guys have been patient. It's 10 minutes over. So if there's no other questions, appreciate your time. Sarah, you want to close out?
No, can I just do something? I'm sorry to be.
Deb's got it.
I'm sorry to be annoying. I won't close out. Besides, Sarah, your hair is cute. I do kind of go on Kareen's situation. I know once a week with Mark could be nice, but I think until we get there, I really do believe every morning, I'm sorry to say, whoever appears and whoever wants to take the helm, or if we just don't take the helm, I think we need at least a 25, 30-minute conversation role play on how to do this until we get there. We need to be a step above everybody else, and this is so confusing. And for us listing agents, I think it's confusing. And for the buyer's agents, I think it's equally confusing. So if anybody wants to step up to the plate and have that morning role play, I'm in. I will orchestrate it. Not that I know it, but I really think we need every morning to do some role play, at least 25 minutes. That's my take on this. I don't think one day with Mark, which Mark, I love you. I don't think one day with Mark Miller is going to help us here, because we're going to be in the thick of it. And there we go.
I will make this point. In last month's, in June's risk management meeting, Stephanie, there is a document in the documents that were sent out last June. And Evie, if I can get you to repost the June risk management docs, there's a document called Open Houses in a NAR Post-Settlement World. That's in the June documents on how to handle open houses. And it's kind of exactly what Kevin King has in his document, but it explains all that. Here's my advice as broker. Don't be stressed out about this. Just let it go. We're all going to get through this. It's going to be a great thing. You're all going to survive. And we'll get through this together. And if you see agents out there that are lost, refer them to Sarah. They might need help. You never know.
I will echo what Robert said. This is opportunity for all. Please keep dialing in. I'm proud of you all for staying on going late. That's amazing. Connect with Evie, Deb, and we can get a Zoom going for anybody who wants to do a morning Zoom conversation. Likewise, if there's a group that wants to get together in the training room, you know, in the mornings or in the kitchen and go through it, yes, that's what we're here for. So it will be agent led to drive that ship. And we will support you all and share it and make sure it's going out to everyone who wants to participate. Ask the questions, keep showing up. You're doing great. You're going to get more market share through this time. We're proud of you. Have an awesome day. We'll see you tomorrow.